Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. Muffin Talk is a weekly radio program to which I invite guests to talk about their work and their passion for issues on community programs, social justice, interfaith relations, Bible studies, or the Catholic Church. Today, our guest is Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, who is joining us from the UK. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Beata.
Thomas O'Loughlin is originally from Dublin, Ireland. He is an ordained priest and emeritus professor of historical theology at the University of Nottingham in the UK. One of his areas of expertise are the topics in the area of liturgy and synodality. Today, we are going to start a four-part series of interviews on the topic of liturgy. Within these sessions, we will also talk about the changes in liturgy as a result of Vatican II. Some of these changes have been misunderstood among the people, and so we would like to explain why they were done. Tom, let's get started with looking at Mass in general. And we start by saying that somebody attends Mass or participates in Mass. Do we gather as consumers or as celebrants?
Well, I think one of the problems we have is that we have for many centuries gathered in a way that makes us consumers. We talked about getting Mass, listening to Mass, hearing Mass. And if you just look at the way churches are still built 60 years after Vatican II, there's the table up at the front, which we call an altar, and then there's row after row of seats. And if you just think about that arrangement, that's the same arrangement you find in the cinema or in a theater or anything else where you're watching something. It's even the form that you see in a schoolroom where there's the teacher down doing an experiment in the physics lab or the chemistry lab, and there's row after row. In the lecture theater, there's the person down there giving the lecture. Maybe they're showing things, maybe they're doing things, but then there's rack after rack of seats. Now, that effectively means that you're there to consume information. You're there for something you want to get. And the essence of consumerism is that it's a one-way relationship. One is giving or selling, and you're getting it, and you're getting it in a very private way. So if we think of the shape of a building, we will often have a key to the way we react when we're in that building. And if you're in a cinema, you're there to consume a film. You've paid to consume the film. You hate it if someone down the way is rattling their popcorn or making noise or tapping their feet, because you are there to get your enjoyment. You're going to take in that film. Now, let's think about this. We Christians say, whenever we gather, Paul says, whenever the people are together, they're the holy temple. Temple's not a building. Church is not a building. Church is the community. The temple is the community. And God is present in the temple. The presence of God is inside the community. This is why Paul doesn't want sin or impurity in the community, because that would impede the presence of God. And then we hear the words of Christ. 2 or 3 are gathered. 2 or 3 are gathered. Now think about it. If God is among us, why are we all in lines, racked, as if we're looking at something that's taking place out there? Like we're looking at that celebrant. No, if God is among us, we should be gathered round so that we're actually looking at one another, so that we're actually observing who the church is, of which each one of us is just a part. To use Paul's language, you are the church. Each one of you is a member of the church, a bit like my arm is a member of my body. And if the Spirit is in the middle of the temple, we're gathered around the temple, looking at the temple, because we're rejoicing that among us, the Spirit is present.
Tom,
So,
but couldn't it be a practical reason when the groups got bigger that it was more practical for acoustics, etc., to be gathering in a way like in a museum.
The reason we did it was nothing. It was long before acoustics. If you went into a Catholic church 65 years ago and you were anywhere beyond the first or second seat, you would have heard nothing. You would have heard nothing. That's why you got on with saying your rosary. It was completely silent. There's a famous statement of a bishop at the council saying, but if we say Mass in the vernacular and people want to listen to us, we'll have to think about getting microphones. He couldn't imagine that there would have to be microphones, because he had spent his entire life saying Mass in a barely audible voice. The only person who was ever heard was the preacher. And he didn't even sit near, he wasn't even near the altar. He was in the pulpit, often halfway down the church. So, the problem is that if you're in a building which is really designed for watching, you become a spectator and just a listener, and it becomes very much a private affair. Well, the thing is, we're all called to offer thanks and praise, the sacrifice of prayerful joy and love to the Father. We do this in Christ, and we all do it as the baptized. So we're all the celebrants. And the presbyter down at the front, he's there to preside, give us voice, to organize us. So if you think about it as all celebrants, we should be gathered around. We need to realize that we're all doing something. And there's another way of thinking about this. Imagine you are going to meet some friends. You arrive, the first thing you do is you take off your coat. If it's winter, you make yourself comfortable and you sit in a comfortable seat. And you say, well, are we all comfortable? Just think of a meeting. You don't even have to be friends. There's a meeting to discuss the best way to organize bus stops. The first thing everyone will do will be to make sure everyone is sitting in a circle. Can everyone hear? Can everyone see? Can everyone listen to everyone else? Are we all comfortable? Oh, quick, making room for another. And so now think of the way we operate when we go into church. We don't even ask are the seats comfortable. We're expected to sit and listen for 3/4 of an hour. And yet, it was a bishop who said to me after listening to a long sermon, I got a numb bum. Well, because the seats were so uncomfortable. We were sitting in a church in Durham, and we're not standard church seating. And we were sitting there for 3/4 of an hour. And at the end of it, we were stiff. And so this is not a way to say we're there to express our joy. So we have to think of the liturgical space as a place where we become the people of God. And that means that we sit where we can see each other, know who the church is, and then actually be comfortable. And of course, 60 years ago, the Vatican Council said, we've got to reorder our churches. But often what we did was we just pulled the table out 6 feet. And we didn't realize that it wasn't what was happening up there to the cleric. It was the whole community that had to change its shape. And it had to become aware of itself that it was the church, not the building. The people are the church. The walls are there to keep the church dry and to keep them warm. And it's just a wrapping around us. We're the temple. The building is just a shelter. And so one of the problems we have is we know we shouldn't think about ourselves as consumers in relation to God. That's almost blasphemous. We know that we're the holy people We're a priestly people. We're constantly told by Pope Francis that all ministry stems from baptism, all liturgy starts in baptism. So we're all the baptized. And so, as the baptized, we're the new community. We're supposed to be showing a new way of living. We're supposed to be rejoicing when we gather. And we're supposed to be aware that we're the people of God. And yet, when you go into actually a building, in the standard rows, the building itself is sending out a subconscious signal. This isn't about us. This is about me. And it's about him down there, the presider. And it's about getting something.
Tom,
and so we have to,
can I just ask, have you seen any churches where this restructuring after Vatican II worked very well? Because I have seen some churches where they put the altar in the middle of the long-shaped church, and the priest has to go very much to the left and to the right. And
well, the point is, we're not supposed to. He doesn't. It's not about the priest. It's can everyone else see everyone else, and that's why the table is put in the middle. If you were just think about you were organizing a meeting today, small meeting, for the most silly of things. Would you put all the people sitting out, if you want everyone to take part, would you put them all in an old-fashioned classroom shape, or would you put them in a circle?
Rather than a circle, but that must be a big circle for the church.
Oh yeah, that's fine. But the other thing is, just think of a classroom. Most teachers know that unless you're giving very old-fashioned style lectures, the rack and rack and rack of seats is actually gives people a 7-minute attention span. If you want to keep people's attention, every teacher knows this. You don't put them all in rows. It may look very, very nice, and it may seem very efficient because you give your lecture very quickly, but it's actually not very good for communication. So, but you see, the communication thing is secondary. It's the theological nature of the church. We are the church. We don't go to the church. We're not getting something. We're getting something, but we're giving something. And that's why we say we're sharing. So we're all celebrant. The whole community is the celebrant. And, you might say, well, hey, no, that's not true. Well, then why does Jesus say in John's Gospel, I didn't call you servants any longer? The ones who are not just listening, they're actually with him. They're with him at his meal. I call you friends. Mm-hmm. And so you don't put your friends in rows. You say, oh, yeah, well, that's just one bit. Well, just look at the language of the liturgy itself. We refer to one another as sisters and brothers. Pray, my brothers and sisters. We ask forgiveness of brothers and sisters. We express peace and reconciliation with brothers and sisters. Well, you see, the problem is when human beings feel one thing and talk about another, so we go into a church and we feel we're just there as observers. We're not very comfortable. We're watching and we're listening, and I want to say my prayers, and it's about me and God. That's a very strong sense, and it's reinforced by the whole physical structure around me. And then we hear language about being the people of God, members of the church, sisters, brothers. That's just noise. That's a little bit like, when you get a bill from the taxman, and the taxman says, We are here to try and serve you. No, no, no. You're really only writing to me because you want my money. So it's cynical. And the problem is if you get a very strong signal in your body that we're just here as consumers, it cancels out the actual words that we're using all the time. And so it's not only that we get a bad experience of the liturgy, but we get a bad experience of the liturgy and we get the sense it's all just words. It really is just make believe. And so I have a, I'm always struck by the fact that for every member of the baptized who's sitting in a church, there are at least 3 or 4 members of the baptized who no longer sit in a church.
Mm.
They're part of the community of faith, but for them, sitting in a church is not part of the experience. And when I talk to people, why do you never feel a need to say, well, it's just words. I can do it as much. I can say my prayers on my own. Well, of course you can, because if you're thinking that it's there just to be me and myself, and that's what the buildings often are reinforcing, then why bother? You can be more comfortable sitting at home or going for a walk. So it's very interesting that people say, well, it's all just words. They use all these fine words because we don't actually get an experience of being the temple of God, being gathered around the Christ with him in the middle of us. And we don't actually feel that we're sharing something, that we're bringing something together, and we're making something by our sharing with one another that's far greater than anything we do as individuals. And so, I sympathize with people who say, well, Vatican II was all just words, because in a way, actually, 60 years on, we're only beginning now to grasp the real deep structures of Vatican II.
And Tom, when we look at our past few years with COVID, we had different examples of how people cope with it. Some had Zoom gatherings where they could see each other and were having a chat. And I had heard comments like, oh, I never had the chance to chat with the people. Now on Zoom, I don't see just the back. I also see the faces. And then there were other sessions where you could only see the priest and you were there, as you say, as like almost like a private mass, because you didn't see anybody else except for the celebrant at the altar.
It's very frightening that we always forget the obvious. And the obvious is we're social animals. To use Aristotle, it's sometimes translated we're political animals, but what he meant by zoon politikoan, he meant was a social animal. And being social animals, we actually want to engage with one another. We love engaging with one another. And if we, as the community of faith, is where the Christ is present, in communicating with one another, we are actually experiencing the gospel. There's an ancient Jewish saying. It's still widely used in Judaism, but it goes back to the time before Jesus, and it's quoted in one of the earliest Christian documents, the Didache. It says, wherever the Lord is talked about, there's a small group talking about the Lord, not just listening to someone down there. Wherever the Lord is talked about, the Lord is present among them. So it's which is more important, to give a lecture on Vatican II or actually to change the shape of the seating arrangements in our churches? People will forget the lecture, but if we change the shape of our churches, then people will experience, they will feel what it is like to be to take on board the teachings from the Second Vatican Council.
And isn't that the quote from Matthew 25, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name?
Yes,
And
yes.
it's similar to what you just said with that quote from the Jewish tradition.
That famous Jewish quotation is quoted exactly in the Didache, and it becomes the basis for the statement in Matthew where 2 or 3 are gathered. And you said a few minutes ago, can you show us churches? Well, actually, in every country, there are a handful of churches that are actually models of what this is like. In fact, a group of liturgical scholars, including some from New Zealand and some from Australia and some from Britain and Ireland, have come together and they've just produced a book called Shaping the Assembly. And if you can get your hands on that book, or better still, recommended to this was recommended to whoever is your priest or vicar or rector or whatever because it was a group of Catholics and Anglicans that produced this book. There are actually photographs there, some from New Zealand, some from Australia, some from Britain, Ireland, and the United States. And they show, I better make sure there were several US scholars involved. I don't want to leave them out. And they actually show what a modern place for the church to meet is. Note, I didn't say what a modern church is like. The church is the people. It's what a modern building for the church to meet.
Can you describe it a little bit?
Well, it's, for instance, it could be, if it's a long thing, put people on 3 sides. If it's a circular building, put them all around. If it's a square building, radiate them outwards in so that everyone feels that they're focused in, they're looking at one another. They realize it's an us, not a me. And the shape must help people experience that.
I think that's to change the order of some churches when you have historic buildings will be very difficult.
Oh yeah, but the problem is we must never, our buildings are there to serve us. We're not there to serve our buildings. We're not running a museum of nice architecture. We're trying to be the people of God. And the people of God don't look back to lovely architecture. They look forward to the kingdom. And so if we're so worried about the lovely building, then we're no longer, we now have created an idol, and the idol is the past. And we're no longer thinking about the church as the community. We're thinking about a church building and all those lovely oak pews. Well, they were great in their time. We've actually realized they didn't serve us very well. They may have looked good, but they're better for a cinema. In fact, you could keep that and use it to as a teaching space or something, but it's not even then very effective. But for liturgy, it's got to focus us and make us aware that we are all celebrant.
And you mentioned in a previous interview that one of the points is also the size of the congregation, because if you want to connect and you're in a building with 500 other people, it will be a lot more difficult to connect than if you have only 100.
Well, if you're in a building with 500 other people, unless it's a very special event, you are effectively in an auditorium, and you're not a gathering. You're just an audience, and that's another problem that we have to address. Human beings work best in small groups, and there's an awful lot of evidence that once a group is bigger than 150, we humans just can't relate to it. And Eucharist and liturgy is about relating not just to God, but relating to the people of God, of whom we entered at the moment of our baptism.
And thank you so much for all these insights, Tom. And I think that also if we consider the church as being the people and we are gathering together to celebrate together, I think that we also avoid certain other problems where it says who is going to be the presbyter, etc. If the focus is on the people, it will be considered in a different way, isn't it?
Oh yes, like the best way to avoid clericalism is to make us all aware of our baptism.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a wonderful way to end the interview for today, and focus on the baptism. And that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we are going to continue this series next week. And so what is coming up at Titipounamu Study and Joy? Well, our next sessions on the Bible will be in August, September. They will be held with Brother Kieran Fenn, a series on women in the Bible. It will be on the 7th, 14th, 21st of August, and then the 4th, 11th, and 18th of September, 7 to 8:30 p.m. New Zealand time on Zoom. And for more information on any current or past programs, please check out www.studyjoy.nz. And all these interviews that we are going to do with Tom O'Loughlin, we're going to have them on YouTube so that they are available for anybody who is interested in. And thank you, Tom, and kia kaha, and keep safe.